On February 21st, Putin declared the Luhansk and Donetsk republics as independent states, offering to leave Russian soldiers there as protection for the people. This action spurred sanctions from the West. The Ukrainian military again prepared for war. Russia announced a military operation along the Ukrainian border, and on February 24, 2022, they invaded Ukraine from the east. For months, Russia had been massing troops on the Ukrainian borders. There were demands from Putin to NATO that Ukraine be barred from joining the military alliance. I've been watching Ukrainian news stories, and I'd like to tell some of those stories, the stories of the people. I think it's important to tell these stories with fervor. In the beginning, the EU and NATO refused to give Ukraine any direct military aid, but they did impose financial sanctions against Russia. This mostly affected billionaire Russian oligarchs and oil purchases that caused the value of the ruble to plummet. Putin announced that his special military operation was necessary to defeat the neo-Nazi Ukrainian government. He's based this war on the idea that Russia and Ukraine are inseparable. He cites historical ties between the two as proof. But if you listen to the first episode of this series, the ties between Russia and Ukraine were more often genocidal than brotherly. Putin's war is a war of ideals. He wants Ukraine and Russia to have the same relationship that it had during the time of the Tsars. It's his mission in life to end Ukrainian independence. Putin defended his ideals in a 7,000-word article claiming that Ukraine has direct ties to Russia. In this article, he wrote, quote, "I am confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. Our spiritual, human, and civilizational ties formed for centuries and have their origins in the same sources. They have been hardened by common trials, achievements, and victories. Our kinship has been transmitted from generation to generation. It is in the hearts and memory of people living in modern Russia and Ukraine, in the blood ties that unite millions of our families. Together we have always been and will be many times stronger and more successful, for we are one people." End quote. The article ended with a veiled threat. Quote, "Today these words may be perceived by some people with hostility. They can be interpreted in many possible ways. Yet many people will hear me, and I will say one thing. Russia has never and will never be anti-Ukraine. And what Ukraine will be, it is up to its citizens to decide." End quote. Ukraine is not the only country that Putin has attempted to gain power over. He's interfered in elections in several countries, including the U.S., in order to put people in power that are more favorable to his agenda. He has stated several times that he will use nuclear missiles if the West involves itself beyond humanitarian aid in this war. This past week, Russia has tested a long-range nuclear missile that could increase the combat power against other countries that are in league with Ukraine. It comes as no surprise. Putin has been threatening to use nuclear missiles since the beginning of this conflict. He has also demanded that the U.S. return Alaska to Russia as reparation for the sanctions it has imposed on the country, claiming that the annexation of Alaska would repair the damage done to Russia by those sanctions. This act alone shows that Putin is not fighting this war for communism. He's fighting it to extend Russia's global reach. He's fighting it so that his power will continue to spread across nations. This isn't about Ukraine. It's more about global domination. It's about Putin becoming a powerful world leader. That seems dramatic, but it's also true. There are rules to war, and Putin has not followed the rules of engagement. There are specific ways to wage war and ways to keep the fighting fair. Putin has ignored all of them. He's invaded territories with no warning. He's allowed and even encouraged his troops to attack civilians, and he's blockaded routes of escape. It seems that most Russian citizens are against this war also. Many refer to it as Putin's war. There have been more than 14,000 arrests in connection with protests in Russia against the war in Ukraine. About 200 people have been remanded into custody. The Kremlin passed a law on March 4, 2022, making it a crime to self-report the war or protest against the war. The punishment is 15 years in prison. That has not stopped protesters. They have just become quieter about it. 20-year-old Christina wore a blue hat and yellow jacket. She wore the colors of the Ukrainian flag to express her protest. She felt that it was the only way to outwardly protest the war without being arrested. Oleg Tinkov, one of the Russian bankers who is falling under sanctions, told CNBC that the war against Ukraine was insane. He said that the war would stop if the Western nations would give Putin, quote, a clear exit to save his face and stop this massacre, end quote. He also claimed that 90% of Russians are against this war. When the war began, Ukraine's Border Guard Service announced that any men ages 18 to 60 were not allowed to leave the country. They were to stay and fight. Women were allowed to leave, but about 15% of the women of Ukraine have chosen to stay and fight next to the men. While they're not officially part of the Ukrainian army, they were trained in field medicine and they were trained to use weapons. 29-year-old Daria Vasilchenko has been responsible for securing a neighborhood north of the capital in Kyiv. She was in public relations before the war began. Men waiting to enlist question her decision to join the army. Quote, they say something like, "Lady, why are you doing this when we are here for that?" I smile and tell them that everyone has their own job to do and everything will be fine, end quote. Alona Bushinska is a 32-year-old makeup artist. She joined the Territorial Defense Forces in Kyiv when the war began. She prepares medicines and makes hot food and drinks for the soldiers. Her grandparents were competitive sports shooters, so she knows her way around a gun, but she didn't want to be cast in that role. But she did tell reporters that she was ready to protect herself if necessary. Kate Matchison told reporters at The Sun that she never thought she would join the country's armed forces, but she has learned how to use basic weapons, including field stripping and AK-47. Quote, it is a very hard thing for a woman to kill, and I never thought that I would ever have to do it. But we have been forced to train for such a terrible thing by Russia. Russians are killing Ukrainian children, so Ukrainian women will do what they have to do to protect them, end quote. Kira Rudik, who is a member of the Ukrainian parliament, told CNN, quote, on the first day of the war, we all gathered together and decided how we can be the most useful to our country. So I am most useful here, where I can bear arms and I can motivate others to do the same. I can make sure that Putin has much more people to fight than he originally thought that he would have, because along with Ukrainian men, there are women who are standing up, bearing arms, and adding to those numbers, because we are enormously strong and we are enormously brave, end quote. On Monday, March 25th, the UN confirmed that 925 civilians had been killed since February 24th, 850 adults and 75 children. Most of the casualties were caused by shelling from artillery, missiles, and airstrikes. On March 23rd, Reuters reported that Anatoly Chubais, who had served as Boris Yeltsin's chief of staff and was also Vladimir Putin's special envoy, resigned his position and left Russia. This act was his protest against the invasion of Ukraine. Throughout the war, many Russians have fled their country. Many left because they didn't want to fight in a war that they don't believe in. They feel that this war is not against their enemies. Instead, they are shedding the blood of their brothers. On March 9th, a maternity hospital in Mariupol was bombed by Russian forces. Among the victims was a young mother-to-be. She was evacuated to a hospital closer to the front line where medics performed an emergency C-section. Her pelvis had been crushed and her hip was detached. The baby didn't survive. Neither did the mother. The mother, upon learning that her child had died at birth, screamed at medics, "Kill me now." Nadia was hiding in the Mariupol Drama Theater when it was bombed. About 1,200 women, children, and elderly people had taken shelter there to stay safe. The theater was crowded. There was no place to sit or lie down, so Nadia's family spent the night of March 8th standing. It was cold, and there was no electricity. Volunteers boarded the windows the following day in order to keep people from getting cut with shattered glass in the event that the theater was bombed. The volunteers had set up a field kitchen near the back entrance of the theater. They made food for those who were hiding there every day. Breakfast was usually warm boiled water. Lunch was a broth. Dinner was more hot water and sometimes cookies for the children. The volunteers promised that no one would starve. The volunteers were taking food from a nearby store to feed the people in hiding. They knew it was wrong, but they needed to keep everyone fed. The pregnant women and those who had just given birth were also in the theater. The women from the maternity hospital were set up in the right wing of the first floor of the theater. There were dressing rooms there, and it was thought that those rooms would be warmer and more comfortable for the mothers. Nadia's family had made friends with some other people who had a place in the basement shelter. These people decided to leave before the shelling started, so Nadia's family took their place in the basement. Before that, they were in the left wing on the third floor. On the morning of March 16th, about 9:45 a.m., a heavy bomb dropped on the theater. People in nearby buildings saw a bright flash, a ball of fire, and they heard the explosion as the theater was hit. The bomb hit the backside of the theater. It then passed through the right wing. The people in the front and the basement survived. The basements were built as bomb shelters. They were there to shelter the people in the event of a war. The dressing rooms that were sheltering the pregnant women and the new mothers took a direct hit. No one survived. Since it was morning, people were lining up at the back of the theater where the kitchen was set up. Nadia's daughter and son-in-law were getting ready to go to the back of the theater to get their water for the morning. Her son-in-law stopped just before going up. He had to tie his shoe. That's when the bomb hit. He was flung into the air by the blast, but miraculously, he and the rest of the family survived. The walls held out. All the people in the basement survived, and they were able to leave. Nothing blocked their way. A little boy was lying in the basement next to Nadia's family. His father had been working in the field kitchen. The child was hysterical. Everyone in the field kitchen had been killed. Nadia took the boy by the shoulders and yelled at him, "Your father is dead. You must live for him." Nadia tried to help the wounded. There were no bandages, so they tore any material they could find into strips so they could bind the wounds. Nadia's daughter, Natalia, would later say that about 100 people died in the bombing. She thought that maybe 200 more died because they were buried under the rubble. There were no soldiers in the theater that day, only residents who had taken shelter from the war that raged around them. The Russians had no threat coming from that theater. On April 8th, 2 Russian rockets hit a train station in Kramatorsk. 52 people were killed and 100 people were injured in the attack. These were all civilians. They were hoping to evacuate from the war. One of the rockets that had been recovered after the attack had the words "For the Children" in Russian spray-painted on the side. This message was reportedly written as vengeance for Russian children. not that it was intended to be used on Ukrainian children.